When we think about the afterlife, we usually picture something, well, pretty abstract, right? A spiritual plane, maybe a state of being. But what if, for the ancients, it wasn't abstract at all? What if it was a real place? A territory so complex and detailed that you actually needed a map to get through it? In this explainer, we're going to look at the afterlife not as a belief, but as a geography. It's maybe the biggest human question there is, isn't it? When you're facing that final journey into the absolute unknown of death, what do? Well, you want a guide. You want a set of instructions, some way to make sense of whatever comes next. And that's exactly what they did. Instead of just dreaming up some vague hereafter, ancient peoples all over the world treated the afterlife like a landscape they could chart. We're talking rivers, gates, specific destinations. They essentially created the world's very first funerary atlases. All right, so here's the roadmap for our journey today. First, we'll dive into this whole idea of death as a terrain you can actually map out. Then it's off to ancient Egypt to see the very first known map of the underworld. After that, we'll check out how Greece and Mesoamerica turned their afterlives into landscapes of judgment. Then we'll shift gears and look at the internal, psychological maps of Tibet. Finally, we'll connect the dots, find the patterns, and ask the big question: why are we so driven to chart the great unknown? See, for a lot of these ancient cultures, death wasn't the end. It was more like a transmigration, a journey to another place. And that place had a real layout, a spiritual ecosystem with its own topography. And to get through it, you couldn't just wing it and hope for the best. No, you needed to know the way. So our first stop is ancient Egypt. Their version of the afterlife was a realm called the Duat. And what's fascinating is that it was basically a mirror of their own world, the Nile Valley, but kind of flipped upside down and filled with all sorts of divine dangers and monstrous gatekeepers. The Duat was doing double duty here. On one hand, it was the path that the sun god Ra had to travel every single night in his boat to beat back the forces of chaos, just to make sure the sun would rise again. And on the other hand, it was the ultimate testing ground for human souls trying to reach eternal life. So, the fate of the entire universe and the fate of one person were happening on the exact same map. And this brings us to one of the most incredible artifacts in history, the Book of Two Ways. This thing was found painted right onto the cedar coffins of nobles from the Middle Kingdom. And it wasn't just a bunch of text, it was a literal illustrated roadmap. What's so amazing about this is that it kind of democratized the afterlife. Before this, only the pharaohs had access to these kinds of detailed guides. Now, other people could get their hands on the tools they needed to survive. And the map itself was incredibly practical. It gave the deceased a choice. You could take the upper blue path of the sky, or the lower dark path on land. Both routes were treacherous, zigzagging through a landscape crawling with demons and riddled with dead ends. You had to navigate around a literal lake of fire, a barrier that would just incinerate the unworthy but would actually purify the righteous. The finish line was Rostau, the kingdom of the god Osiris. But to get there, you needed this map and the sacred spells that acted as your guide. Knowledge, quite literally, was navigation. Okay, let's jump to some other cultures now and see how they built on this idea. Because while the Egyptians were focused on a navigational puzzle, others wove morality and physical trials right into the land itself. In ancient Greece, for example, the underworld wasn't just one place. It was a whole series of different regions. And where you ended up, your final address, was all based on how you lived your life. It was a kind of moral geography, where your virtue, or lack of it, determined your eternal neighborhood. So this system created a very clear sorting mechanism. If you were a hero, you earned a spot in Elysium, this amazing paradise. If you were just an average person, you were sent to the Asphodel Meadows, which was this vast, gray, and honestly pretty boring field. But if you were wicked, you were thrown into Tartarus, a bottomless pit of punishment. Here, judgment wasn't just a verdict, it was a physical place on the map. Now contrast that with the absolutely brutal landscape of the Mayan underworld, Xibalba, which means the place of fear. This wasn't a moral test. This was a straight-up gauntlet. Before you could even face the gods of death, you had to get past rivers of scorpions and blood. And then came the real test, a series of houses, each one meticulously designed death trap. I mean, imagine being locked in a room with shrieking bats, or a chamber made of pure fire. Your only hope of survival was raw cunning and trickery. So far, we've been looking at these external, physical places. But the Tibetan tradition gives us a really profound shift in perspective. With the Bardo Thodol, also known as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the map of the afterlife isn't a place you travel to, it's an internal atlas of your own mind. So the core idea here is the bardo, which just means an in-between state. And while we experience lots of bardos, like in dreams or meditation, this text is really focused on those crucial transitions that happen during and after death. The journey it maps is 100% psychological. The journey kicks off with the Chikai Bardo, right at the moment of death. This is where your consciousness gets a glimpse of its true, pure nature, the clear light. Now, if you don't recognize it for what it is, you move on to the Chonyad Bardo. And here, you face this terrifying parade of gods and demons. But here's the key instruction on the map. They aren't real. They're just projections of your own mind. Navigation is recognition. If you fail to see that, fear and your karma pull you into the final state, the Sidpa Bardo, which then guides you toward your next rebirth. Okay, so we've looked at physical maps, moral landscapes, and even atlases of consciousness. So what's the common thread here? Well, when you zoom out, you start to see this universal blueprint for afterlife cartography emerge. Across all these different cultures, we see three core principles again and again. First, the afterlife is always a terrain, an actual place with a physical layout. Second, knowledge is your key to getting through it. You need a password, a spell, or some crucial insight to move forward. And third, judgment is often baked right into the geography itself, either by sorting souls into different places or by testing them with the landscape. And all of this brings us to the biggest question of all. Why? Why did so many cultures, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, all independently come up with the same idea, to draw maps of what comes after we die? Well, the answer is actually pretty profound. These maps are an incredibly powerful cognitive tool. They're a technology for managing anxiety. They take the ultimate unknown, that terrifying, chaotic void of death, and they transform it into something structured, something knowable, something navigable. It's an act of imposing order on chaos, the same way we might draw up a business plan to chart a path through an uncertain future. And that's really the ultimate takeaway here. This ancient impulse tells us something fundamental about who we are. Whether we're charting the oceans, the stars, or the territory beyond life itself, our response to a great and frightening unknown has always been the same. We don't just speculate. We pick up a tool, and we start drawing a map.